He laughed. It was brief, a soft, professional chuckle that slid too easily into the sterile air of Westbridge Private. Dr. Harris had been examining the chart with the kind of practiced detachment that comes from decades of seeing hopeful claims collapse under cold statistics. Anna Monroe felt the laugh as a small breeze against her own conviction. It should have blown her away. Instead, it settled against the back of her neck like another reason to keep trying. "You're a very good nurse, Anna," he said, not unkindly, folding the paper back into the file. "But they've been in that state for almost a year. We have protocols. We watch for reflexes, for signs of purposeful motor activity. Mostly, you develop tolerance for the way people hold on to possibility. Don't let it cost you sleep." Anna kept both hands wrapped around the basin she'd carried in from the supply room, her palms damp from rinsing. For a heartbeat, she considered answering with analysis. EEG variability last quarter, the way small micro-arousals can precede more organized activity. But the laugh had already closed the space for clinical debate and left only the private geography of her patients. She smiled instead, because defiance in white felt useless. "I'll keep monitoring," she said. Grant Carter's room smelled faintly of lemon hand soap and cedar, trying, desperately, to make clinical comfort look like home. The suite was more living room than ward. Velvet drapes, a dark wood desk recessed with photographs of life that had paused in formal frames, a tray of untouched breakfast items on the far table. The contrast was always the same, polished wealth and the small, stubborn human things that belonged to Anna's work, a folded terry cloth, a soft toothbrush, a paperback novel she read out loud before sleep. She moved through those small rituals as if they were prayers. She unlatched the cuff and checked the IV. She smoothed the sheet across his chest, careful beneath the line of bruises the crash had left. She read the times of feeds into the chart and then chose a place on the bedside chair because proximity mattered more than procedure sometimes. She talked, not because she imagined him hearing every word, but because the cadence of someone who is spoken to is, by all accounts, less prone to silence. "Morning, Grant," she said, but the name was for herself as much as for him. "You missed the rain. The orchids finally got the sunlight you like. Don't worry, we held the good coffee for you." He looked like a statue from a distance, thick lashes shadowing faces that had once done everything without thought, driven, chartered deals, laughed at jokes that landed square. His jaw was just a plane of skein and memory now, but Anna had learned to see the smallnesses. The way his fingers rested slightly flexed, like someone at the edge of waking. The faint scrap of scar at his temple. The gold cufflink on the nightstand that had been removed and set down in case it pressed against his skin. She washed him with absolute care. She always began with the hands. There was something sacred in those movements. Water over knuckles, the way skin who had been still long enough to forget its softness slowly remembered. She talked the entire time, a catalog of trivialities meant to stitch presence into that quiet body. On the second day, she noticed something that did not belong to the expectations of an immobile patient. The smallest gathering of muscle at the base of his right thumb, a tremor that stopped when she changed the angle of her hold, as if he was testing whether the world noticed. When she mentioned it in rounds, Dr. Harris smiled with the polished amusement of a man who had, himself, learned to treat hope like a visiting relative, politely received but not indulged. "Tremors are common," he said. "They can be subcortical. Watch the EEGs. Document, of course, but temper interpretation." Temper interpretation. The phrase sat between them like a divider. Anna left the room with the basin still warm in her hands and a resolve that had nothing to do with the charts. She would see him in ways that chart could not. There was a rhythm to her days, punctuated by small beats that anyone who cared would recognize. She arrived when the sky looked blue-silver and left after the hospital corridors dimmed to a safe hush. Between those hours, she read aloud from novels with characters who were not meant for gilded suites. She rubbed lotion into his knuckles. She played the occasional pop song because laughter had once echoed between the columns of Grant Carter's laugh, and she wanted to remember the sound. She fed him spoonfuls of cool broth and adjusted pillows until the angle of his jaw seemed right. She sat on the foot of the bed and told him about the pigeons that had nested on the terrace, their gray heads bobbing like tiny, perfect metronomes. People asked why she took on this assignment when there were younger, less complicated cases elsewhere. Anna shrugged, as if to say it answered itself. She was good at small things. She believed small things had a habit of stacking until they became something else. She had a sister in Cincinnati who had once told her that people don't often notice the way the light falls on a face until that face is already gone. Anna had learned to notice. The first time Grant squeezed her hand, it was so faint she would have missed it if she hadn't been holding his fingers. It was not a grip, no protest against immobility, but a micro-adjustment, like a man checking the fit of a glove. She froze. The room seemed to hold its breath, though she was alone with him. She rubbed kisses onto the back of her wrist to keep her hands warm, and waited. The line on the monitor hummed away, faithful and non-committal. She wrote in the chart, "Observed brief voluntary hand movement. Responds to name with micro-adjustment. Continue monitoring." Then she walked to the nurse's station and watched as Dr. Harris skimmed the entry. He read it and smiled with that same practiced kindness that had softened his chuckle before. He arched an eyebrow as if the world had offered something quaint. "That's optimistic," he said. "Micro-adjustments are often reflexive. We'll keep an eye on it." His tone folded the possibility into a general category, optimism, and it felt, to Anna, like labeling faith as a personality trait rather than an observation. The next week, the micro-adjustments came more often. Once, while she brushed his hair, his eyelid fluttered and did not fully close again for an extra second. Another time, his toes flexed in a pattern that almost matched the beat of a song she'd left playing. She videoed the movements on her phone, a small, private archive of minutes that seemed to breathe on their own. She documented everything. She sent copies into the file. The staff tolerated her persistence with the same gentle patience reserved for relatives who could not let go. Dr. Harris spoke to her about prognosis and probabilities. His charts and statistics were firm and unyielding. He did not mock. He simply lived inside the world of data. And yet, when the laugh came that morning, it landed differently. He stood in the doorway with his palms flat against the folder, and the sound was small but clear. "You always see stories, Anna," he said, eyes kind and remote. "Perhaps that's why nursing suits you. But the brain is not a storybook." "You're not saying he won't wake," she said, because she wanted to trap his words and keep them accountable. She wanted to see the exact angle of his disbelief. "I said," he repeated, folding the page, "the data do not support the likelihood of meaningful recovery after this duration in this particular injury pattern. We offer care, we do not offer miracles." The office smelled of antiseptic and coffee. Anna heard in the undercurrent of his phrase a kind of professional caution that was also a ward against any loss of reputation. She understood it. She also knew that people slept past statistical probabilities all the time. People made improbable recoveries from things no one expected. She was tired of arguing, so she retreated to the room with a basin and a set of towels, and she prayed in her own way, by making choices small enough to be plausible and persistent enough to be annoying. A week later, as rain feathered at the window, she found him looking toward her. It was subtle at first. The eyes, behind their shield of closed lashes, moved as if reading something no one else saw. Anna had him in a light she had seen before, eyes shifting beneath closed lids, searching for shapes in half-sleep. But this movement had a deliberate quality, like someone choosing a page to read. She sat closer, closer than protocols sometimes permitted, and read the title page of the novel. The light between oceans. "Grant," she said gently, "if you can hear me, squeeze my hand once." The hand tightened, not a full grip, not yet, but it tightened in a way that made her breath catch. She left a note in the chart and then waited for rounds. Dr. Harris arrived with his customary certainty and exhaustion. He asked how the night had been. Anna explained, and then, because she had learned the art of not letting things be smothered by authority, she pulled up her phone and showed him the clip she had filmed, just 12 seconds of a closed eyelid, an eye rolling, and then the skin fluttering into a faint, deliberate squeeze. He watched it once, twice. His face remained private. He did not laugh this time. Instead, he told her to continue documentation, to prepare for a scheduled EEG to look for cortical activity. It was the professional response she wanted, measured, objective, a way to bring data to the possibility. That afternoon, when the EEG tech arrived, there was a quiet electricity in the room. Machines hummed like distant engines. The tech, polite and procedural, placed the electrodes with a practiced touch that almost bordered on reverence. Anna stayed with her hand on Grant's arm the whole time. It is difficult to explain the way the monitors looked when they begin to show a pattern that was not expected. The first graphs are a map of ordinary variability, alpha waves, sleep-driven slow activity. But mid-afternoon, the screen produced lines that had a shape someone trained to read them would recognize as organized, as coordinated, as something approaching the scaffolding of return. The technician stepped back, blinking, as if her eyes needed to recalibrate. "There's increased focal activity in the left frontal cortex," she said into the recorder, a sentence that felt like a hinge. Not what we expect for his established injury pattern. Someone else called for Dr. Harris. The waiting room in Anna's chest tightened. When he entered, his professional face was angled toward the screen. For a heartbeat, he was simply a clinician reading a readout, a man whose work had been built on discernment. Then the expression shifted. It was not drama so much as a recalibration, a lowering of the shield, the brief glimpse of a person discovering that their map no longer matched the ground. "We need imaging," he said. "Do a CT and a full assessment." Nobody laughed. The CT was scheduled with efficiency, the kind that smothered its own astonishment and practicality. Anna rode on the edge of the team, permitted because she had been the one to call it. They brought Grant through hospital corridors that smelled of citrus cleaner and the faint ghost of overnight coffee. A nurse adjusted the straps and whispered about sedation protocols, as if the patient were just a man about to take a nap. Anna clung to the tray with her hands and watched the screen as the technician slid the table in and out, as the images flickered from monochrome to layers that an expert would interpret as meaning. When the neurologists read the scans, they read them with the vocabulary of their profession, terms too precise to be poetic. There was increased blood flow to areas that had been dormant. There were focal areas where tissue appeared responsive. Nothing spelled certainty, nothing spelled magic. But together with the EEG, it formed a pattern that demanded a new kind of attention. Dr. Harris stood by the monitor. The folder he had clutched the day he laughed fluttered slightly in his hands. He made a small sound, half exhale, half thought. He had been trained to speak with caution. He adhered to that training now. "This is unanticipated," he said, then softer. "This is significant." Anna felt warmth in her throat, a mixture of relief and something like vindication that made her cheeks sting. She had not wanted validation for herself, particularly not from a man who held the prejudices of an entire profession in his tidy pauses. But to see him adjust, slowly, almost as if he were learning about his own limits, was part of the arc she had been waiting for. It meant the possibility she nurtured did not live only in her hope. It had a language. Over the next 48 hours, the hospital pulsed with a quiet energy. Orders arrived for more intensive monitoring. Physical therapists were consulted, a swallowing assessment scheduled. Each decision was cautious, each step measured, so that nothing about the response could be outpaced by hubris. Anna sat with him as the team discussed his case at the foot of the bed. She listened to words she had not expected in that room. Targeted stimulation, progressive engagement, trialing of verbal prompts. Grant's awakening did not arrive in a single cinematic moment. It arrived as accumulation. There were micro-gestures, increased eye tracking, a breath that felt more like selection than reflex. There were nights when a nurse would come on shift and press her hand against his chest to find that the rate had shifted into a calmer rhythm, and the nurse would look at Anna with a small conspiratorial smile. There was, however, one afternoon when the world rearranged itself. Anna had been in the middle of telling him about a trivial domestic calamity, the time she had clogged the kitchen sink and declared it an act of fate, when he opened his eyes. It happened slowly enough that at first she thought it a trick of light. Then his irises focused, first diffusely, then excruciatingly narrowly on the point of her hairline where a stray streak lay free. The moment he fixed his gaze was not a triumph. It was a question. "Grant," she whispered, because the word tasted like a doorway. His lips moved. Air sighed between them, imperfectly formed syllables. The monitors picked up the shift, and in seconds the room filled with the practical, urgent energy of professionals summoned to a new task. The resident arrived with a clipboard. A therapist crossed the threshold with a smile that was all restrained hope. The rhythm of beeps found a new cadence. "Can you blink twice if you can hear me?" the therapist asked. 2 blinks, deliberate. It was the smallest of agreements, a handshake between 2 islands. The staff moved with efficiency, but beneath their clinical movements were ordinary human currents. Quickened breath, the exchange of glances that said, "We have all been waiting for this," without saying how much it matters. Dr. Harris stood at the foot of the bed, and for a breath he was still the man who had laughed. Then he looked at the screen, at the EEG lines that had shifted from the dull wash of sleep to traces that now promised organization. The laugh had once been a small dismissal. Now it felt like the sound of a man realizing he had been wrong. He did not make a spectacle of it. There was no grand apology, no dramatic confession. Instead, he found Anna's eye and allowed a look that was complicated. Professional respect mingled with an admission that certainty had limits. "We underestimated this," he said quietly. The diagnosis that shocked him was not a single word shouted across the room. It was the careful assembly of data. Increased cortical activity consistent with organized, purposeful processing, motor responses that appeared voluntary and reproducible, imaging that showed localized perfusion suggestive of reparative processes. The team translated these into neat sentences for the chart. For the rest of the ward, the effect was magnitude enough. They transferred him to a higher level of monitoring. The attending team scheduled speech therapy trials and organized sessions for sensory stimulation, music he might once have enjoyed, photographs of family faces, the smell of lemon oil that apparently was his favorite. They talked about probabilities and cautions and the need, above all, to prevent overinterpretation. This is the language of clinicians, the way they explain miracles away, not denying them, but putting them through the sieve of practice so that hope becomes plan. Grant's first words were not complete. The first syllable faltered like a man getting used to using lungs he had not practiced in months. "Anne," he managed once, then again, a breath between, as if he were mapping sound with unsteady fingers. Anna held his hand and answered him with noises that said both patient and companion. "Yes, it's Anna. You're here." She kept her voice steady, the way a buoy keeps ship from drifting, and he looked at her as if he knew the shape of the anchor. In the hours after the awakening, Dr. Harris moved through the ward differently. His steps were more careful. When he spoke to Anna, he did so as a colleague, not an arbiter of impossible things. "The findings are stronger than I would have predicted," he said. "We need to prepare for slow progress. We must avoid premature optimism. Anna nodded. She had never wanted to be right simply for the pleasure of being proven right, but she had wanted to be listened to. For a profession that prized data, being believed as the bearer of the first small data points mattered. She had not looked for applause. The correction she saw in Dr. Harris's face was enough. The public attention that comes with a wealthy patient's recovery began to leak through the curtains of the suite. News outlets owned their cycles in half-hour blocks, and networks loved a story shaped like recovery. Hospital administration spoke about confidentiality and the need to manage information. Anna kept quiet and steady. Her priority was care, not headlines. Grant's family arrived in a flurry of tailored coats and quiet, controlled emotions. Faces she had not seen before, uncles and lawyers, the types who measure grief in gestures, made the rounds with speaking tones that seemed adjusted for cameras. Nathan Carter, somewhere in that orbit as she would later learn, was not in the suite that day. There were other people who cried with the efficient stoicism of those who had rehearsed the tears they might need to display. When the first questions about how the crash had occurred came up in small talk, casual, private, they were shrugged away as things for investigative teams to determine. People who own the world often have entire economies for containing scandal. Lawyers, managers, publicists. For now, their priority had been an outcome. For Anna, the question of what had happened in the seconds before a life goes quiet was practical. It mattered because sometimes the cause of injury had consequences for the present. In the first week after he opened his eyes, Grant's memory came back in pieces. There were flashes, an image of night rain on pavement, a specific smell of gasoline, the sound of a tire that had made an odd shriek. There were also blanks, soft and heavy. He would reach for a name and suspend mid-thought, as if the thread of a sentence had broken. The small early confessions he made were not dramatic. He asked why his hand had been held, why someone read to him. He was embarrassed by his own fragility in ways that privileged men are often, apologetic for weakness, assuming responsibility for suffering. Anna told him it was okay to be human. She told him that cooking was a good therapy and that pancakes were a harmless test of the tongue. Grant's first sustained conversation was with Dr. Harris during a morning review of his rehabilitation plan. On the second day, the man who had once laughed sat with his hands folded and a nervousness Anna had not seen before. The office was a small chapel where science met its own humble edges. "You surprised us," Dr. Harris admitted, voice low. "You surprised me." Grant looked at him with a flat honesty. "I didn't expect to not die," he said, as if possibility had been a default option he had abandoned. He blinked, uncertain whether to give his weakness permission. "Why did I?" The question hung in the air. It was medical, and existential, and legal, all at once. Anna felt that she had been standing at the lip of that question for months without the vocabulary. She had been the one to report tremors, to file notes, to push for testing that, to outside eyes, might have looked like a sentimental indulgence. Now the tests had aligned, and the same man who had once laughed at her suggestion looked as if the topography of authority had shifted beneath him. When the neurologist, Dr. Harris, spoke again, he did so with a mixture of professional restraint and personal recalibration. "The diagnostic pattern we're seeing calls for continued monitoring," he said. "There's evidence of purposeful response. We'll need to map motor intention versus reflex, perform language trials, and assess cognitive recovery in controlled settings. It will be incremental." The word incremental was a slow drumbeat that promised work and patience. It was also a kind of shelter from the idea that a single event could rewrite a life overnight. Anna took to nights reading to him again, chapters marked with light fingers, something to restore the cadence of a life interrupted. Grant would listen, and sometimes he would smile, a small arrangement of muscles that suggested humor remembered. Sometimes he would squeeze her hand with more intention, as if summoning a phrase into being. The hospital corridors hummed with activity. Tests were scheduled and then rescheduled. Neuropsychologists set up assessments that were equal parts puzzle and compassion. Anna began keeping a notebook that was not part of the medical record. Small observations written in pen. Responded to song 9-2. Smiled at line about the sea. And she kept those notes next to photographs he had once kept on his desk, arranging the private and the clinical like two halves of a life. A week into his awakening, something else arrived. A question from the physiotherapy team about whether the crash had been investigated by external authorities. Anna had thought the question belonged to the future, but now it inhabited the room like another machine we might need to calibrate. There was nothing untoward in the way they asked, no suggestion of foul play, only a desire to understand context, because context informs treatment. Was there substance exposure? Was the crash consistent with a mechanical failure? When Anna volunteered what little she had, a recollection of the way the brakes had locked, a detail Grant had once muttered in a dream, Dr. Harris frowned. "Those details belong to the investigators," he said. "But if you have documentation, place it in the file." She had a photograph on her phone, taken days before when she'd noticed the tiniest scrape on the underside of the fender on the car that families had parked in the service bay. A tiny, odd groove that might have been caused by misplaced hardware. She didn't know how to interpret it. Few nurses do. But she knew what it had felt like to notice. She put the image in the patient's supplemental folder and flagged it as something for the legal team to review. The act felt small and enormous at the same time. As the days turned into a month, Grant's speech improved in fits and starts. He could recite short sentences, pronounce names, and, with effort, perform simple tasks under supervision. Anna watched him relearn the shape of utensils, the small choreography of buttoning a cuff, the stubborn memory of his own laugh. Each success carried the weight of a tectonic shift. The world had once been arranged one way, and now it was not. She felt both exhilaration and exhaustion. Caring for someone who is returning from silence is like standing on the seashore while the tide retreats and then slowly comes back in. You do not know which wave will be the one that brings the flotsam that matters. Meanwhile, the word in the hospital had shifted from curiosity to caution to a guarded wonder. Dr. Harris, once a man who smiled at the edges of hope, now consulted more often with Anna about daily progress and plan. He would still use language to temper expectations, but his eyes carried the humility of someone who had been corrected by a fact he had not expected. The laugh, that small emotional punctuation to the early chapter of their working relationship, had become a relic Anna sometimes thought about with a soft, private satisfaction. It was not about triumph. It was about being acknowledged. One night, after a particularly long day of therapy, Anna sat in the quiet next to Grant and turned the page of a book she had read to him 100 times. The room was dimmed. The monitors sounded like a distant phosphorylation of stars. He looked up at her and, with a deliberation she now recognized, said a name that was small and jagged with age. Anna. Tears surprised her then. Not from drama, but from the cumulative compression of months of small attentions finally condensed into speech. He held her hand, and his fingers closed around hers with a firmness that belonged to a man reclaiming muscle and memory. "Thank you," he said, voice rough with disuse, "for not leaving." The confession landed between them. It was personal in a way she had not imagined. She wanted to say something wise and measured, something that would answer months of silence and the long nights of proximity. Instead, she laughed, a short, incredulous sound. "I didn't do anything heroic. I made coffee. I read bad novels. I stole all the good cookies from the tray." He smiled in response, and the sound was like consonant meeting vowel, unpracticed and vulnerable. The private contours of his gratitude slowly filled the room. For Anna, the experience was complicated by the fact that her professional life required boundaries. She was a caregiver. She was not there to be rescued by gratitude. Yet, human beings had a way of rearranging obligations into something softer. She allowed the moment to be what it was, a man admitting reliance and a nurse acknowledging the human need to be seen. It would have been easy and wrong, to imagine that this awakening erased everything that had happened to Grant outside of his recovery. Crashes do not come from nowhere. Accidents do not always have clean beginnings. Some things, once broken, demand questions that go beyond the scope of rehabilitation. The first time Anna thought about the possibility that the crash might not have been accidental, it was a seed of doubt planted by professional curiosity rather than a conspiracy mind. On quiet nights, she took to flipping through public records and news articles she could access without special permission. She read police releases about the event. The crash had occurred on a rain-slicked sweep of road, a single-vehicle accident documented as loss of control. Plenty of such things occur, but there were technicalities that lodged in her mind. A brief mention in the report about inconsistent witness testimony, a line in the maintenance log indicating a recent but unexplained service to the brake system, the absence of expected damage on the driver's side wheel. She told herself she was reading too much into nothing. She told herself again that her role was to care and not to investigate. But care, in Anna's understanding, included protecting the person she tended when the truth might have consequences. She filed the details mentally. For now, though, the story of the present mattered more. Grant's brain was doing the slow, strange work of retying its circuits. Therapists recommended exercises, a tray with pegs to pick up and place, a simple puzzle to encourage coordination. He learned to manage a fork. He learned to laugh. Anna watched each attempt with the same reverence she had once reserved for births, creation in small steps, each one improbable until it wasn't. Dr. Harris moved through the days with a different cadence. He continued to be rigorous, to speak in measured sentences, to warn against undue celebration. But there were also moments when he lingered in the doorway a moment longer, listening to Anna read and witnessing the way the man in the bed responded. The hospital can be a confessional of sorts, where professionals meet not only to trade protocols, but to learn about their own limits. He had been wrong to laugh at her. He recognized that without melodrama. His correction was quiet. He would, on occasion, press his lips together and say, "Good observation," which to Anna was almost as valuable as an apology. The world outside began its slow process of noticing. A brief piece in the evening cycle chose a human interest frame. The headline read something like "Recovery Against Odds," and the segment distilled into a tidy story the months of careful, unsexy work Anna and the team had done: tests, therapy, and time. The piece mentioned the hospital's team and included a tasteful shot of the suite's dark wood and the row of family photos that had once been untouched. All the while, the question of how the crash had occurred hovered like a storm cloud to be addressed later. People who live inside business empires, as Grant did, have complicated relationships with danger. They also have complicated relationships with family. Anna's role was not to sort those knots. Yet if there was structural danger, mechanical tampering, financial incentives that might explain motive, then the right thing to do was to make sure such information found its way into official channels. The morning after a therapy session in which Grant had successfully buttoned a shirt, an email came to the ward's legal liaison. There were requests for the full maintenance logs of Grant's vehicle and the police report, and someone had kindly requested that Anna provide any personal observations she might have kept. She compiled her short list: tremors, the odd scrape on the car, the dream fragments he had murmured about tires singing. She hesitated, then included the photograph she had taken weeks before. It felt at once like crossing a line and doing the only reasonable thing. It was procedural. It was also, morally, an opening. She could not, in that moment, have predicted how the stream of small choices she had made, documenting micro-movements, insisting on repeated testing, photographing a scrape, would gather into something larger. She only knew that when the diagnosis and the data aligned to contradict a learned dismissal, the world of certainty had to learn to accommodate surprise. At the end of the day, while Grant slept with a book resting against his chest, Anna stood by the window and watched the city go quiet. The lights of the skyline were soft, and somewhere a delivery truck rolled past. The immense apparatus of money and influence orbiting the Carter name felt at once both present and irrelevant. Inside the suite, under the clinical hum, hands were still the primary language. Hands that washed, hands that held, hands that returned movement to a body that had been still for too long. She thought of Dr. Harris's laugh again. It had been small and human and dismissive, and now it felt like the opening line to a lesson he had to learn. The diagnosis, those careful, scientifically stated words, had shocked him because it forced him to see what he had not expected. It reshaped the hierarchy of who had knowledge in that room. She felt no triumph in the shift, only a steady, cool flame of relief. That night, as rain skittered down the glass and the monitors sang their low song, Anna checked Grant's hand one more time. His fingers rested against hers, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to imagine futures in which small things stack until they become something else. She did not know the shape of what was to come. The legal inquiries, the confrontations with family, the long months of therapy that would test the strength of any bond. But she felt, in the simple pressure of his palm, the possibility that persistence had a kind of power. Outside the window, the city lights blurred into a watercolor smear. Inside the room, a man who had been years away from speech tried, in fragments, to remember the tune of his life. Anna hummed it with him. The sound was not a cure, but a companion. It was enough for now. If this moment surprised you as it did them, consider staying on this channel. You won't want to miss how the next pieces fall into place. In the weeks that followed, the ward's rhythm shifted to include a parallel cadence, the measured choreography of recovery alongside the careful, paper-heavy movement of inquiry. Anna found herself walking between both worlds, a bridge with no title. She attended therapy sessions and then walked down to the hospital's legal office where a clipboard could change a course of action. She was not trained as an investigator, but she had particular training as an observer. The details she had collected, photographs, odd maintenance notes, the scrap of a witness statement that read with a slipperiness she could not forget, began to look like a pattern when arranged side by side. It started with a call from Detective Ruiz, a steady woman with an appetite for detail and an impatience for sensationalism. The police had reopened their file after a review flagged anomalies, a maintenance entry that noted an unscheduled brake adjustment 10 days before the crash, a dash cam from a courier van in the area previously overlooked that captured a stopped car at an intersection where no stop should have been logged, surveillance footage from a garage door that showed the Carter sedan returning with a mechanic's truck trailing close behind. None of these items, alone, screamed malice. Together, they formed a question that could not be ignored. Anna met Ruiz in a quiet conference room at the precinct. The detective slid a thin manila folder toward her, the kind of folder that holds the deliberate motion of investigations. Inside were prints of the photographs Anna had taken and redacted copies of maintenance invoices. Ruiz did not dramatize. Her voice was low and efficient. She said, "You saw things that mattered. You documented. That helps. We need to know if you noticed anything else." Anna felt the odd, habitual reluctance of someone stepping out of a caretaking role into a world that pronounces guilt. She told Ruiz about the scrape she'd photographed, Grant's dream fragments, the sound of tires, the the scent of fuel, and about the sense of wrongness she had held like a pebble in her pocket. The detective listened without surprise. She had heard the stories before. Small observations, nurses' notes, a photograph that suddenly looked less like trivia and more like evidence. The next few days became a blur of work Anna had never expected to do. Ruiz obtained service records and ran them through a network of databases. A forensic mechanic examined the brake assemblies and, under magnification, found wear patterns inconsistent with the reported mileage and a fastener that had been deliberately scored in a way meant to hide tampering. It was the sort of detail a layperson would never see and yet impossible for an expert to ignore. The mechanic's report was clinical and slow, a list of deviations from manufactured specification, a notation that a particular component had been reinstalled incorrectly and would have failed the next time the system was engaged. Then there was the financial trail. A forensic accountant traced a wire transfer made a week before the accident from an account in the Carter family's extended holdings to an account belonging to Marlowe Automotive Solutions, a small local firm with no prior business history with the Carter fleet. The link was not direct. The money had bounced through an intermediary firm and then been withdrawn in cash. But when Ruiz's team dug into company registries, they found registration documents connected to a shell owner with the same listing agent who managed multiple entities tied to one name, Nathan Carter. Standing back, the pieces drew a straight line that had been invisible in isolation. Nathan's motive unfolded in ordinary shades: envy, the pressure of inheritance structures, a succession plan that had once been rumored in boardrooms and whispered at family dinners. Motive alone is not proof. Motive needs the hard backbone of evidence. The mechanical report and the bank transfer provided that backbone. The chain could be presented in a warrant application. It was careful, lawful work, no dramatics, no vigilante confrontation, just procedure and paper aligning toward accountability. When Detective Ruiz presented the case to the district attorney, Anna watched from the doorway, her hands folded as if she were still at a bedside. She felt both like an intruder and like someone who had earned the right to be in a room where justice is decided. The DA authorized a search warrant. On the day they executed it, officers moved quietly but decisively across Nathan Carter's estate, serving papers, securing computers, and seizing ledgers. Nathan claimed surprise. His lawyer's voice was smooth, practiced. He insisted his client had nothing to hide. The officers were careful. The evidence they sought would either substantiate suspicion or disprove it. Within 48 hours, a small room at the precinct filled with people who had once been figures at a distance in Anna's life: the hospital lawyer, the forensic mechanic, a bank compliance officer. They built a narrative from receipts and microscopic marks and from the traced steps of a transfer that had been funneled through a company that, on paper, did not exist. Nathan's fingerprints were not necessarily on the bolt that failed, but the procedural record tied his financial behavior to the chain of events that led to the vehicle being misconfigured. It was enough for probable cause. When the warrant returned with its result, emails, a partial log showing communications with the owner of the shell company, a note that suggested knowledge of the brake job, the police moved for arrest. Nathan was brought into custody not as a melodramatic villain from a headline, but as a man being treated like any other suspect, read his rights, escorted, processed. He protested, of course. He dismissed the documents as circumstantial, claimed that corporate accountants made errors and that rival factions wanted him out. But the press of paperwork told a different story. Grant's first clear reaction to the news came days later when the detectives put a sanitized version of the case facts before him to obtain his formal statement. He absorbed the information in short, focused bursts, his speech still rebuilding, but his eyes steady. He listened as the investigators explained that the data suggested tampering and that they were proceeding on that basis. The word Nathan hovered between them like a cold wind. Grant's face, when it registered an emotion, betrayed less the triumph of accusation and more the dull, stunned ache of betrayal from within a family. Anna watched him as he took in the implications. If Nathan had taken a step toward causing harm, then all the small things Anna had done, recording movements, insisting on tests, keeping a photograph of a scrape, were not eccentricities, but contributions that changed the course of an investigation. She felt a strange detachment, the sort that comes when the world rearranges itself and you find the furniture you carried placed exactly where it matters. News of Nathan's arrest, when it finally circulated, did what such stories always do. It rippled outward, bringing with it a storm of commentary and a tide of opinion. The hospital moved to shield its staff from invasive inquiry, and Westbridge Private's legal counsel briefed everyone on confidentiality. Dr. Harris, who once made that small, skeptical laugh in the doorway, found himself answering questions from colleagues and administrators in a way more public than his usual clinical rounds. He did not try to defend the dismissal. He could not. His role had been a professional one, and he had been required, by the facts now on the table, to correct his prior assessment. He sought Anna out in the suite the morning after the DA filed the charges. The morning had the soft clarity of late summer light pouring through the drapes, and Grant was at physiotherapy. Dr. Harris came not with a file, but with a look that was frank and slightly off balance. He stood for a long moment before he spoke. "I misread the situation," he said simply. There was no flourish, no need for spectacle. I let the weight of probability crowd out other signals. For that, I'm sorry. You were right to keep pushing. Anna felt complicated things at once: vindication, relief, and the quiet humility of someone who'd been corrected publicly. She accepted his apology without a flourish. "We all want to get it right," she said. He needed someone to keep noticing. "Then thank you," he said. "And if you'll let me, I'll be more attentive to those quiet observations in the future. Sometimes the charts aren't the whole story." He meant it. Anna believed him. It was not a neat dramaturgical moment of conversion. It was a professional recalibration, the kind that matters in medicine because it changes how people are cared for going forward. Dr. Harris's humility did not erase his earlier skepticism, but it did close a loop. The title's echo, the laugh, the shock had landed in the formality of an apology and a promise of changed practice. Grant's recovery continued under the watchful, careful procedures that had brought him this far. The legal process rolled forward on its own schedule. Nathan was held on charges related to tampering with a vehicle and conspiracy to cause harm. The case would be adjudicated by courts, not by the hospital staff. Anna's role in the courtroom was limited to testimony about the observations she had made and the documentation she had provided. She gave her account with the calm precision of a professional who had simply done her job in extraordinary circumstances. The judge's gavel and the legal filings were straightforward and sober. They were designed to measure culpability, not to dramatize the human stories tangled in it. Meanwhile, the relationship between Anna and Grant deepened in ways that were less for the record and more for the private hours between therapy and sleep. He had been formed in a world where gestures were often strategic. She had come from one where gestures were functional and humane. What grew between them was not an immediate romance, but a gradual, mutual rediscovery. He asked for her opinion, once about a line item on a rehabilitation plan, once about how a friend handled a particular negotiation, and she offered it like she offered care, plainly, without agenda. He, in turn, began to show the kind of attention that had once kept his world running, small, deliberate, and unshowy.
He learned with some chagrin and with a bit of pleasure how to make tea just the way she liked it. She laughed when he burned his first attempt.
There were quiet conversations, late-night exchanges where the therapy room hummed behind closed doors and the hospital's night staff moved like shadow figures in the corridors. Grant would revisit fragments of his past, sometimes with regret, sometimes with a blankness that frightened him. He was accountable for the privileges he had inherited and the mistakes he might have made. He was also learning what it meant to be dependent. For Anna, dependence did not feel like power. It felt like the mutual vulnerability people discover when one person has to be honest about needing help. One evening, months into his rehabilitation, they took a walk on the hospital terrace. The city lay out beyond, luminous and indifferent. The air smelled faintly of lemon oil, a scent Anna associated now with progress and with the suite where they'd first met. Grant walked more steadily than before, his movements deliberate, testing balance and coordination. When they reached the terrace's edge, he stopped and looked at her as if considering a question. "You stayed," he said simply. Anna shrugged and looked at the skyline. "You were my patient," she replied, "and then you—" She hesitated, searching for the right word. "And then I was less sure of who I was," he finished for her. "And you were there. You kept me present." He turned toward her, and something in his gesture read like an offering. He reached into his jacket and produced a small box. Anna had seen gift boxes before, moved them from professional bemusement from the bedside tray to an inventory bin. This one was not hospital-issued. It was private and heavy in his hand. He opened it. Inside sat a simple ring, yellow gold, a plain band with a small scratch along one edge, the sort of imperfection that meant more than any polished perfection ever could. It matched neither the opulence he had known nor the absence of it. It looked like something a man could wear and not feel performative. "I'm not good at grand things," he said, and his voice shook a little. "I don't have a polished speech, but I know that whatever happens next, I want you to be part of it. Will you marry me?" The question landed in the terrace's cool air. Anna felt her chest tighten. Her professional instinct said to maintain boundaries. Her human instinct said that the last year had been an unspooling of roles and expectations. She thought about the months of therapy ahead, the legal processes still lingering like clouds on the horizon. She thought about the man who had, after a year in silence, learned to ask for help. She thought about the small ritual of washing hands and the way those same hands had changed a life. "Yes," she said, and the single syllable contained all the things she had been carrying: care, fatigue, hope, and willingness. But she did not say yes, as if it were a surrender. She said it as consent, a deliberate, thoughtful agreement between two people who had earned that moment through slow work and mutual respect. Their engagement was quiet, a private exchange noted in a few photos and a brief hospital announcement. Friends and family were informed properly. Nathan's legal troubles loomed like an unwanted shadow, but the two of them tried to keep personal joy from dissolving into public spectacle. Dr. Harris offered a toast at a small gathering of staff. He spoke of clinical humility and of the ways medicine sometimes demands that practitioners listen not only to machines, but to the people who sit bedside. His words were plain, and Anna appreciated the restitution for what it was: the right response by a professional who learned something about the limits of certainty. The wedding itself was modest by Carter standards and generous by Anna's. They chose a small chapel on an island outside the city, whitewashed, sunlight pooling on wooden pews, the smell of salt and lemon in the air. Grant's family attended with varying degrees of openness. Nathan, of course, was not part of the ceremony. Friends from the hospital, therapists who had lugged equipment and patients, sat proudly in a pew. Dr. Harris, in a suit that rendered him slightly unfamiliar to Anna's eyes, stood a little off to the side with dampened eyes and the expression of a man who had been taught and corrected by life. Anna walked down the aisle in a dress that was simple and sensible, nothing ostentatious, everything true. Grant's smile when he saw her was the quiet thing she had once nursed into being, a laugh remembered and now given back. They exchanged vows in which neither tried to promise the impossible. They promised presence, choices, to seek help when they needed it, to let intimacy be mutual and consenting, and to keep honesty as a practice. After the ceremony, as they stepped out into the bright light, music floated from a small quartet. Dr. Harris approached them both and pressed a folded envelope into Anna's hand. She opened it later in the stillness of the evening and found a handwritten note. "Thank you for reminding me why we listen." That was all. She felt again the strange reward of small things stacked into consequence. Life after the wedding was not a tidy Hollywood crescendo. Grant returned to his business obligations with a new humility threaded through the usual demands of corporate life. He reorganized some philanthropic priorities, increased transparency in his family's fleet maintenance program, and instituted tighter oversight that, Anna noted with a mix of amusement and pride, would make it harder for something like a tampered brake to hide behind paperwork again. He worked with counsel and compliance teams to establish protocols that had been born of a painful lesson. Anna resumed her nursing role with the same quiet devotion, but she also allowed for a new center in her life. She and Grant lived in a way that reflected both their differences and their shared values. Simple rituals, honest conversations, and the patience to deal with legacies that do not dissolve overnight. They learned to argue well. They learned to apologize and to ask for help. They built a life that turned away from the idea that wealth could substitute for compassion. As for Dr. Harris, his relationship with Anna became less hierarchical and more collegial. He invited her to speak at an internal seminar on the value of bedside documentation and the importance of listening to nursing observations. He did not dramatize his earlier laugh. He used it as a teaching moment. That was the kind of quiet restitution Anna preferred. Systems shifting, not performances. The legal resolution, slow and procedural, ended with charges against Nathan that he opted to contest. The courtroom process was sober and necessary. The evidence Anna had helped surface was part of the record. In the end, the system worked imperfectly but justly. Nathan faced consequences commensurate with the findings, and the family, fractured in ways that money could not mend, reorganized itself with boundaries that had been absent before. Years later, when Anna and Grant would tell the story to friends who asked about the odd arc that had taken them from hospital rooms to a life shared, they would emphasize the little sustained acts that had shaped everything. Patient documentation, persistent observation, the willingness of one nurse to keep noticing when others were inclined to translate hope into mere sentiment. They would laugh about burned tea and about the ring with the tiny scratch. They would remember the early days of therapy and the monitors that had once whispered in a language they were learning to read. On the anniversary of the day he first squeezed her hand with intention, Grant took her back to the terrace. The city lights shimmered below. He held her hand and for the 1,000th time thanked her for staying. Dr. Harris, years later still a figure in their lives, would occasionally appear at family gatherings with a bottle of wine and a sheepish smile. The man who had once laughed, now the man who taught residents how to listen. Anna thought about the trajectory of all that had happened and understood finally how fragile certainty can be and how strong the accumulation of small acts can prove. The doctor had laughed. The diagnosis had shocked him, but it had led to a wider attentiveness, an institutional shift that might spare others. That, more than any single courtroom or ceremony, felt like the kind of justice that endures. If this story moved you, share it with someone who believes in quiet persistence. And if you want more stories like this, subscribe for the next one.